Hello and welcome back to Chapter 5 in your workers' compensation curriculum. Today we're going to be talking about benefits under workers' compensation. But just as a way to add some context, I want to remind you what we've talked about so far. By now you should have a good understanding of the workers' compensation system as a whole, including what goes on with federal workers' compensation and its relation to tort law. We also talked about the definitions, or how the statutes define employers and employees, and how the statutes define injuries to workers. Today we're going to talk about the benefits available to injured employees under workers' compensation statutes. The focus and basic premise in this chapter is to talk a little bit more about the idea that employees surrender certain rights in order to be covered by workers' compensation, and that employers agree to pay into that system. And we're going to talk specifically about the benefit structure that's available in the workers' compensation systems around the country. By the end of this chapter, I'd like you to be able to explain the medical benefits available under workers' compensation systems, describe the important differences between temporary and permanent partial disability, define how an injured employee qualifies as permanently totally disabled, explain the death benefits available to an injured employee's family, and discuss the role of workers' compensation schedules in determining compensation amounts. So as I said, we're going to discuss the types of benefits available to an employee under the workers' compensation system. And these days, an injured employee can expect any of several different types of benefits. We'll examine each in this chapter. If you suffer from a work-related injury or illness, you can expect medical treatment, disability payments, voc rehab or vocational rehabilitation, and ultimately, if there is a death, then your family can expect some death payments. Keep in mind that workers' compensation is basically state law, and that there are variations from state to state. But there are many similarities, and we're going to concentrate on the common denominators here today. So once we discuss which type of benefits are available, we're also going to talk about how the benefits are awarded, how they're calculated, discuss the distinctions between temporary and permanent, partial and permanent, and finally consider actions that may result in termination of benefits. So one of the first concerns we have under workers' compensation is that the injured employee receive medical treatment as quickly as possible. Medical and wage benefits, of course, are the primary reason to have workers' compensation insurance in the first place. And these medical benefits play a central role in the whole premise behind workers' compensation statutes. So statutes that emphasize medical benefits authorize or emphasize that the employee is entitled to receive medical treatment that is reasonably necessary to cure the injury, relieve the symptoms, and place the worker back on the road to making a full recovery when that is possible. Medical treatment includes visits to doctors, treatments by nurses, dentists, chiropractors, and other medical professionals. Take a look at Exhibit 5-1 in your book. It gives you a pretty good outline of what's included and what's not included. There's an interesting dichotomy here between personal injury law or tort law and workers' compensation law. In tort law, we're generally looking to make the victim whole again, and workers' compensation isn't set up that way. Remember, it's a safety net to provide medical benefits, wages, and things for injured workers. As a result, employees are generally barred from seeking pain and suffering type damages. We're not trying to make the employee whole again. We're trying to put them back on a road to recovery. And while medical benefits are generally comprehensive, the ultimate decision is based on whether or not the medical treatment is reasonably necessary, and the authorization or the determination about the employee's care rests with the attending physician, followed by a review of the Workers' Compensation Board. An interesting side note, since workers' compensation benefits are a contractual benefit and not a property right, employers and employees are authorized to enter into agreements where the employee actually waives their medical benefits rights. You can't make that agreement contingent upon a hiring or continuation of employment. It has to be of the employee's own free will, in other words, and they're always subject to the Workers' Compensation Review Board. And what the review board is going to be looking for is that this agreement wasn't forced on the employee. As part of the medical benefits available to injured employees, we see an inclusion of physical rehabilitation. That's going to include things like splints, crutches, wheelchairs, and other medical devices or apparatus that are necessary to the medical care or rehabilitation of the injured. Injured workers are also going to receive some compensation for their transportation costs. In other words, travel expenses to and from the doctor, gasoline. Even if it's far enough away, some meals can be reimbursed. We talked briefly earlier on in our discussions about non-standard injuries. In other words, what happens if there's some pre-existing injuries or a pre-existing illness? How do workers' compensation statutes address these unusual situations or multiple injuries? Let's take a look at some of the different categories and how we deal with each one of them. The first one we want to talk about is pre-existing injuries or illnesses, and how does the court deal with a situation where an employee is already suffering from one illness or injury, and while they're at work experiences another qualified illness or injury? Well, there's a couple of rules we're going to look at. The first is that the court will allow that the employee be compensated for each injury individually. In other words, they're going to look at the first injury, provide an award for that, and it is possible to have a second injury and a separate and distinct award for that. Multiple awards at the same time are allowed. The second rule is that they're going to look at the impact on the employee overall by combining all of the injuries. So, for instance, if an employee has migraine headaches when you hire them, you take the employee as you find them. If you're the employer, you take the employee as you find them. Now, let's say this employee who is prone to migraine headaches once or twice a week receives a blow to the head that now increases those headaches to an everyday thing. Well, while the first injury was pre-existing and not covered by workers' compensation, the second injury that increased the total impact on the employee is compensable. So in other words, even though the initial migraine headaches were not a work-related injury, the increase in severity based on a work-related injury is covered, and the entire injury or illness is covered. It doesn't matter that the migraines were there before she started. And what's important to understand about this is, let's say that employee came with no migraine headaches, received a blow to the head, and had migraines there once or twice a week. Well, that would be probably a partial disability situation there. However, if it was pre-existing with the 1 to 2 migraines per week, and the work-related injury, the blow to the head, now increased to an everyday thing, the employee might be eligible to receive a total disability rating, even though that first partial was not work-related, because the later work-related injury increased it. The impact on the employee is a total disability rating. And the important thing to understand here is, as we've said in previous chapters, the employer or the workers' compensation system takes the employee as it finds them. If they come in with injuries, that's how you accept the employee in the first place. If the injuries are exacerbated, then you're responsible for that exacerbation. The employee is also eligible to receive benefits during what we call the healing period. And the healing period describes the time period in which an injured employee recovers from the injury or illness. And they are entitled to receive temporary disability payments during the entire healing period until they've reached their maximum healing potential. Now, in addition to medical benefits, we're also going to talk about disability payments, which are another benefit provided to an injured employee. The amount that an employee receives depends on several factors, including their actual earnings and the classifications of the injuries as temporary or permanent. There's 4 classifications we're going to talk about: temporary partial, permanent partial, temporary total, and permanent total disability. Temporary partial, while it's the first category we talk about, can sometimes be the most complicated from calculating benefits. And the reason is, by definition, the employee is not totally disabled. In other words, they're able to do some work. And so, as we'll see later on, if there is a reduced work schedule or reduced work requirement available, the employee may be required to come back to work and perform those duties. And so therefore the benefit is going to be based on the amount of reduction in their ability to perform their old job. Whether or not they come in and participate in a less strenuous job and sort of offset the benefits they would otherwise received is going to play into that calculation. Take a look at example 5-1 in your book. It gives you a great example of a temporary partial disability scenario. Temporary total disability means that the employee is totally incapacitated from performing employment or finding any gainful employment for an occupation in which they're reasonably suited by experience or training. It doesn't mean that they're completely disabled, can't perform any household chores or tasks, can't take care of themselves. It has to do with their ability to perform jobs that they are qualified for by experience or training. But it's not a permanent situation. In other words, they will at some point heal to the point where they can go back to work, whether or not it's in the same job or in some type of less strenuous situation remains to be seen. But for the time period, this temporary period, they are considered totally disabled. Now this is a very high threshold, and it's not something that you can self-certify. It's going to have to come from a medical examiner, which is usually the employee's doctor. They're going to have to qualify them as temporary and totally disabled. So how do we differentiate between temporary and permanent disability? In most states, you're going to see the definition of permanent disability including a condition that's going to last for the conceivable future, one that we don't expect to improve over time. However, if the medical examiner believes there's a possibility that the condition will improve or that it's only going to last for a relatively short period of time, then we're going to identify that as a temporary disability. I know things can get a little bit confusing when we start jumping around between temporary partial, temporary total, permanent partial. So I want to come back to this slide and show you again. So far we've talked about temporary partial disability, permanent partial disability, and now we're going to move on to the temporary total and permanent total. So we're dealing with a quantification of both time and disability, or the effect of the injury on the employee. So let's now talk about permanent partial disability. So the quantification of time is permanent for the foreseeable or conceivable future. The quantification of disability is only partial as opposed to total. So our definition of permanent partial disability is a work-related injury that leaves a worker with a permanent condition that will not resolve itself over time, but that doesn't keep them from doing any type of work at all. So essentially what we're talking about here is a situation where the injury is permanent, but it's not to the extent where they can never go back to work. It's just that they can't go back to the job they were previously doing. So it's a partial disability. And what we're going to look for here is a person who has some form of physical disability, but they're able to work, they're able to find gainful employment despite the disability, but the work they're able to do is at a lower earning capacity because of the disability itself. And finally, defining permanent total disability, we have a quantification of time that is basically forever for the conceivable future, and we have a reduction in the ability to find gainful employment that is considered total. In other words, the employee can't return to any type of work, and that would result in a rating of permanent total disability. And so again, our four categories are temporary partial disability, permanent partial disability, temporary total disability, and permanent total disability. So how are these disability payments made? Well, normally we're going to see a situation where the employer pays these work compensation disability benefits on a weekly or a bi-weekly basis. However, there is the option for a lump sum disability payment. And in some cases, the Workers' Compensation Board may authorize a payout of the entire sum in one single payment. That's referred to as a lump sum payment. This can be troublesome because the payments are meant to help the employee along the way during the healing period. And when employees are given the entire amount up front, sometimes they don't make it last as long as it needs to, and you end up with an employee in distress before the healing period is over. Remember that workers' compensation benefits do not include pain and suffering. They are restricted to the loss of income and the payment of medical expenses. This is not a tort situation where we're trying to make the employee whole to include the pain and suffering. It's only going to include those things that are reasonably necessary to bring the employee back to work, if that's possible. As you can see, in some cases, we're going to be required to make a calculation based on earning capacity, or more specifically, the reduction in earning capacity. For instance, we need to know what an employee earned prior to the injury and how much are they able to earn after the injury. The difference between those two figures is a loss of earning capacity, or a loss in earning power. And so benefits under workers' compensation, such as temporary partial and temporary total disability, would be based on that difference between those two figures. Remember that in the event that the injury results in death, workers' compensation also provides death benefits for funeral expenses and payments to the employee's spouse and children when the employee dies because of a work-related illness or injury. Now, it's important to remember that provision of benefits is not automatic, and it doesn't go on forever and ever. So let's talk about denial and termination of benefits. A couple of the most common reasons we see for the termination of benefits are, well, the employee recovers, they're able to return to work. And remember, this is only to take care of the employee during the healing period. So if they return to work, their benefits are going to stop. And the other reason is we're, again, going back to the idea that we're not trying to make the employee whole, we're trying to achieve a maximum possible recovery. Once that employee has been rehabilitated to the point where they're not going to recover anymore, then we're going to terminate that benefit. But we are going to look at the difference between earning capacity before the injury and after the injury. So there may be another benefit that starts to apply once maximum recovery has been achieved. One reason that employees get denied benefits is obviously they're untruthful about something that affects the injury. If they completely lie about it, they weren't injured on the work. Let's say they were out playing tennis, they twisted their knee and they hobble into work and then fall down, and the employer is able to prove that the injury didn't occur on the job. The employee lied about it, and so they're not going to be compensated under workers' compensation because it was a sports-related injury from outside of the workplace. Another situation where we see benefits terminated is where the employee refuses medical treatment. If a qualified medical examiner or doctor says you need this type of treatment in order to achieve maximum recovery, and the employee doesn't want to accept that, they're essentially saying that they want to remain injured or ill. And if the employee is refusing to help themselves get better, then at least part of the employer's responsibility is going to be reduced based on that refusal and based on the difference between what the medical treatment could have done for them as far as bringing them back to employment, and where they're going to be because they didn't accept that treatment. So, the award of workers' compensation benefits can involve some complicated issues, as we've just seen. The amount that an injured worker receives depends on numerous factors, including the determination of whether the injury is temporary or permanent, and whether it's recognized under the workers' compensation statutes. Compensation benefits can be denied for refusing medical treatment or by making false statements, but not for legitimacy or immigration status. Important things to remember there. Hopefully you understand a little bit better now the benefits available under workers' compensation.